I am at the University of Kentucky. I work with small and backyard flocks and 4-H and other youth programs as well. And I'm also coordinator for the monthly webinars that we have here at the E-Extension. And this is our last one for the year. We haven't put together the program for next year yet, but this time I'm the one presenting, and it's feeding a small and backyard flock. And in a webinar that we had a few months ago, we had a presenter talk about poultry nutrition in general, and I'd like to go into some of the more practical aspects of feeding a small and backyard poultry flock. So we'll see how this goes. Okay. One of the things that I like to start off with is thinking that water is a forgotten nutrient. It's one of the most important. They can live longer without feed than they can without water. And a shortage of water for just a few hours can result in reduced egg production. So clean water should be available all the time. If you don't use an automatic watering system, fill the waters at least twice a day. They may finish it up in the morning. And a laying hen drinks about 25% of her daily water intake in the last 2 hours of daylight. So it's important that they get the good water before they go to bed. So don't forget about water. Just a brief overview, because the previous webinar went into great detail about poultry nutrition. The things that we look at are energy from carbohydrates and fats, proteins, which is mostly for amino acids, minerals, which are the macro minerals and the micro minerals, and then the vitamins, which are the water and soluble vitamins. So all of those things have to be balanced in the feed that you get. If you go and look at a production manual, this is not for you to know each of the individual numbers. It's just to give you an idea that the nutrition requirements vary over the development of the birds. So for example, the protein content varies considerably. You get some differences in the methionine and lysine levels, which are the essential amino acids. And then of course, calcium is a big factor for laying hens versus chicks. But if you'll see any chart, the first thing that comes up is the metabolizable energy value, and the levels of the other nutrients are all determined based on the energy level of the diet. If the energy level of the diet changes, that will change the proportions of the other feed ingredients, of the other nutrients that are required. Because a chicken eats to meet its energy requirement, so the amount of feed that it's going to eat has to be able to meet those nutritional demands. And this is the principle that they use when they're formulating feeds at a feed mill. And so if you take a complete feed, which is formulated for a particular energy content and nutrients to meet that energy content, and dilute it with scratch grains, you are changing the energy value of the diet, and they can eat less and therefore get less of the nutrients. And that will affect nutrient deficiencies. I see a lot of nutrient deficiencies. The main drop in egg production I see when people contact me is because they're taking a complete layer feed and they are diluting it with scratch grains to try and reduce the cost of the feed. So I don't like scratch grains. The only time that you might want to use scratch grains is in the winter when their energy requirement is a little higher, especially if your house is not overly insulated. They may have more of an energy requirement to keep warm. So you're either going to feed it in the excess feed, or you're going to have to provide it as an energy source. So it's important that the chickens get a balanced diet, just like we need to get a balanced diet. So when you look at a feed label, this is an example that came out of Tractor Supply. You'll see that it'll have a name and the nutrient content. And the only thing that I don't like is that there is no energy level. So people ask me, what level of protein should I have in my layer feed? And some will be feeding 14, some will 16, some will 18. And a lot of that depends on the energy content of the feed, which is not given on a feed label. So it's hard to say which is better because you don't know the energy content and how much of that feed they're actually going to consume. The lysine and methionine are the essential amino acids that are first and foremost for poultry. It'll give you a minimum of crude fat, a maximum of fiber because you don't want too much fiber in the diet. Calcium is a maximum and minimum. This is a high level because it's a layer feed. Phosphorus is also needed for egg production, and then salt. And you'll see a max or min level, not a specific level because the diet formulations will change, but they want to get about the same target level every time. So then if you look at the directions, it will tell you, what it's for, and this is when they start laying. This one's telling you to give it before they start laying. And it's important that a feeding program is only as effective as the management practices followed. So if you're feeding a nice, effective diet, nutritional diet, but you're not supplying supplemental light in the winter when the number of hours of light per day go down, you may not see production year-round because of the problem with the lighting system and not the nutrition. The other thing that you'll see on here is a list of ingredients. So the energy is from processed grain products and grain products, which doesn't really tell you much. They are deliberately vague because they will change some of the grain choices depending on the prices of the ingredients, and they don't want to print a new label every time they reformulate the diet. So they're very vague about it. But we need energy for life, growth, movement, etc. And carbohydrates are the main source of energy in the feed. And basically, carbohydrates are compounds with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, and such as the glucose molecule. The glucose molecule together can make starch, or if it's connected in a different way, it can make cellulose. And so chickens can digest starch, and although cellulose is also chains of glucose, it can't digest cellulose because of the linkages between the glucose molecules. So that's an important reminder. Chickens are not cows. They cannot digest glucose. Okay, I will let it. Okay. Supplemental light. Is there a specific number of hours of light required? The number of lights per day should not decrease. So if you're at a particular level, you should not decrease it. 14 is usually a minimum. I wouldn't go much higher than 16 hours, but you want to maintain it. And most types of light will work, whether it's the incandescents, which are becoming harder to find, or the LEDs, or the compact fluorescents. All of those will work just equally well. So hope that answers your question, Julie. So some of the dietary sources that you'll find in a poultry diet, corn is the one we use here in United States. It's the most readily available. It is also the gold standard to which other ingredients are compared. So it's the most easily digestible of the different grains. But a lot of people don't want to use corn because mainly it's GMO corn, or they just want a different ingredient. They want to grow something different in their area. So if you're living in Europe or Canada, for example, barley and wheat are very common alternative grains that are used in poultry diets. Barley, you want more of a hulless type of barley because of the fiber. But the problem with barley and wheat is that they both have anti-nutritional factors in them. Too much barley or wheat can result in pasty manure, which will stick to the butt of the chicken and clog them up. So it all depends on the strain of the barley or wheat. There are different types of barley and wheat. Some have more of the anti-nutritional factors than others, but feed enzymes are available, non-GMO feed types that you can use in barley and wheat to reduce those anti-nutritional factors that cause the viscosity of the grain to change, and so that they can be used, and they are widely used in Europe where corn does not grow well, and in Canada. Some other sources that people have looked at, one is sorghum. You need to look at the type of sorghum. Sorghum can have tannins in it. There's brown sorghums and white sorghums, and the white sorghums have very little tannin, if any. The brown sorghums can have varying levels. Tannins will interrupt digestion, cause problems, but there are varieties. Most of the varieties grown in the United States are low tannin sorghums. If you're working in Africa, you might find more of the high tannin sorghums, which is what I worked with when I was in Kenya, which can be detrimental to the use of the bird. So you have to be careful about what kind you're using. Oats are very high in fiber. So if you want to use oats, you have to use hull-less oats. Hull-less oats are not dehulled oats. They are a variety of oats in which the hulls fall off when they're harvested, and so they have a slightly different nutritional profile. Hull-less oats have been used in a variety of different diets, so they're an option for some areas. Oh, I got something blinking here. What in the chat room? Oops. I got too many things open. Chat. What about millet and some of the other seeds? Yes, millet will work as well. Some millets can have high tannins, but most of the millets grown here are low tannins, so they're not usually a problem. Pearl millet has been used a lot, and it can be used to increase omega-3s a little bit. It does have that benefit. We did some research here at the University of Kentucky looking at pearl millet, and it is a good energy source in poultry diets. Okay, if you're feeding grains, then the question becomes, do you grind them or do you feed them whole? And most of the research with whole grains has been with wheat and broilers. There's been some research with layers and some research with sorghum, barley, and pearl millet. It's limited, but most whole wheat and broiler research is done in Europe, where whole wheat feeding is quite common. So that is an option for some of the farmers, that if you're growing your own grains, you could use them whole. That will save you on grinding costs. You feed it with a balancer type of diet, and so you have to get that formulated separately. What do we got here? What is considered too much fiber, and what happens if the hen eats too much fiber? Depends on the type of the fiber, but anything above 7% is getting too high. then you can start getting all sorts of digestive upsets. If you have too much fiber, they won't be able to get much nutrients out of the feed because of the high fiber contents. It will affect their nutrient intake as well as the digestibility of the feed that they eat, and you could get fermentation in the gut causing health problems. Okay, come on. Okay, some of the research with whole grains has been contradictory, mainly because of the differences between the types of grains that have been used, and how it's fed and what the balancer is. So it's really hard to compare across experiments to see what works and what doesn't work. Some of the good work shows that it has a benefit on the gut microflora. There's an improvement in gizzard function because it has to work harder to digest the whole grains. Adding a bit of grit can help with that as well, to break down the whole grains. You get a larger gizzard, which tends to help with digestion. There are some effects on better performance, especially with broilers. You get some increased feed efficiency as well. But as said, the results vary depending on the type of grain, the balancer that's been used, and the type of bird. So those are all confounding factors. Sometimes you need a training period before because you can't always feed whole grains to young chicks because it's too big. But in the older birds, you might need a learning period to adjust to the whole grains if you were feeding ground grains before for the chicks. Another option with whole grains is choice feeding. This was popular in the 1930s and has started coming back. It goes on the chicken's ability to select a balanced diet when given a choice of ingredients, but you have to give it the right choice of ingredients so that they can balance their diets. With whole grains, it's usually a grain plus a protein, vitamin, mineral type of mix that you can use to balance out the feed. Sorry, I'm trying to keep track of questions while I'm talking, so sorry for the distraction. The problem is that whole grains, doing choice feeding will require extra equipment because you need to have feeders for the different types of feed. The feed form and shape can be an effect. Birds prefer to eat larger particles as they get older, so you can get some finds that are declining, not being eaten. You're getting feeder design can affect how they eat the different grains. Sometimes you can put 2 or 3 different grains. Sometimes you have different portions of the balancer. It's based on the idea that chickens have this nutritional sensory to know what they want to eat, what they should eat. Nutritional wisdom, I think, is what they call it. But sometimes you'll get the chicken will overeat the corn or will overeat the balancer. So sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So it depends, again, on the types of choices that the birds get. Okay, for dietary energy, you can also use fat, which has 2 1/4 times as many calories as the same weight of carbohydrates. Saturated fats are solid at room temperature, and unsaturated fatty acids are liquid at room temperature. Some of the common sources used are tallow or vegetable oil. With the cost of vegetable oil, it's not used as much as the tallow is, but if you're going for a all vegetarian type diet, then tallow is not allowed, so you would go to a little bit more vegetable oil. It does help to keep the dust down. It makes it a little bit more palatable, and it does supply energy, so that can be used in the formulations of the diets. And fats don't just supply energy, they also are important for the fat-soluble vitamins. Vitamins A, D, E, and K cannot be absorbed without fat in the diet. So you can't go fatless diet. You need to have them there for the absorption of the vitamins. And linoleic acid is a fatty acid. Fatty acids are the building blocks of fats, and linoleic acid is a required fatty acid. If you're feeding a corn-based diet, they get enough linoleic acid, but if you're using some of the alternative grains, you may be short in linoleic acid, and therefore feeding the vegetable oil will help to replace the linoleic acid that's short in the other grains. Okay, so some people like to increase the omega-3 content of their eggs or poultry meat, and one of the ways that you can do that is with flaxseed. Flax seeds are high in omega-3s. The problem is that it has to be ground, and it's a really fine seed. If anybody's seen it, it's hard to grind. The hull is very hard to digest, and if you don't grind it, it will just pass through the digestive tract unaffected at all. You just have a bunch of flaxseed in your droppings. Feeding a little bit of grit can help with that as well, but grinding is the best option, but you need special equipment to grind flaxseed. So it can be hard to get that extra fatty acids using flaxseed. You have to be careful not to put too much flaxseed in. Anything above 5–10%, you're going to start having problems. You don't want too much omega-3s in the eggs or meat, because then it starts to taste fishy, it starts to smell fishy. So you got to get that balance between the omega-3 enriched and not smelling fishy. If you are trying to increase your omega-3s, USDA labeling requirements do not allow you to say that your eggs are omega-3 enriched unless you have the lab work to prove it. If it's only for your own consumption, it doesn't really matter, but if you're trying to sell it, you can't make a claim that it's omega-3 enriched just because you fed the flaxseed, which is high in omega-3s. You can say that you fed a diet high in flaxseed or high in omega-3s, but you can't say that your product is higher unless you have the lab work to prove it. So that's important to remember. Come on. Some other sources of fatty acids, kelp meal, which can also be used for some of the B vitamins, can affect your omega-3s, and algae meal is becoming more popular. There are different types of algae, so it depends on what kind of algae you're growing, but algae meal is becoming more popular as an omega-3 enrichment. It especially has the DHA omega-3, which is important for brain development. So not all omega-3s are created equal, so to speak. If you're having a diet that is high in fatty acids, you usually feed, they will add a ethoxyquin to the diet. It prevents the fat from going rancid. If you're feeding organic, you can't use ethoxyquin. You have to use a natural antioxidant, which is typically not as effective as the ethoxyquin, but you can't put ethoxyquin in certified organic poultry feeds. Okay, to the proteins, which we need for muscle. Remembering that protein is made up of amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, and it's the amino acids that they need, not so much the protein. They will break down the protein to its individual amino acids and make the protein that they require in their own body. Is there any research done on using chia seeds in the diet? Yeah, that's a new thing that they have started looking at, and I haven't seen any lately, but I do believe that chia seed can be used to increase omega-3s. I'm not sure of the levels, or if you have to do anything special to it like you have to do with flaxseed. But yes, there are some people using chia seed in the diet to increase the omega-3s. So back to the proteins, we got the amino acids. And if you look at the feed label again, it will say plant protein products and or animal protein products. Again, very generic so that they can use whatever they want and not change the label. So typically in the United States, soybeans are the main source of protein in poultry diets. Typically, it's fed as soybean meal, which is the byproduct from the extraction of oil. Soybeans have a trypsin inhibitor. Trypsin is an enzyme involved in protein digestion. And so if you feed raw soybeans, you can have problems with the pancreas and other organs in the body because they're not able to break down the protein. So the process that is used for oil extraction with soybeans deactivates the trypsin inhibitor, so it's not a problem with soybean meal. It's usually a solvent extraction for commercial soybean meal. If you are feeding organic, it has to be mechanically extracted because you're not allowed to do solvent extraction for organic poultry feed. So, make sure you're looking at that if you want to go organic. If you want to feed whole soybeans or ground soybeans, they have to be roasted first. That will deactivate the trypsin inhibitor and make the protein, the nutrients in the soybeans available to the animals. Other countries like Canada and Europe, where they don't use so much soybeans, field peas are more common, and canola meal. Canola is a Canadian rapeseed. And it's the meal after the oil extraction, so you have to make sure it's mechanically extracted if you are doing the organic. Again, field peas don't typically need to be roasted. You can include a little bit more if they are, but there is research looking at just feeding raw field peas ground. They tend to work fine. Some other things that you might see, sunflower seed meal. Again, as a byproduct, I didn't have a picture of sunflower seed meal. I only had sunflowers, but you get the idea. You extract the oil and you get the meal left over. The problem with sunflower seed meal is that it's high in fiber, so it's not as easily digested. Typically, when they extract the oil from sunflower seeds, they dehull it first, and then they add the hulls back at a certain proportion to help with the oil extraction. So it depends on how much hulls they put back as to how much fiber there's going to be in the diet. What about feeding whole sunflower seeds? If you feed whole sunflower seeds, it's going to be high in fiber, so you have to limit how much you use. You would have to feed grit to help with the breakdown of it. I wouldn't feed too much of it because you're feeding too much oil then. But you could feed some whole sunflower seeds if you wanted. It's not typically done commercially. Recipe for homemade balanced organic feed. Well, that's really hard because, as you can see, there are a lot of different ingredients available. You would need to know what ingredients you have available and where you're getting them from. So what's the nutritional profile for them? A lot of different factors that are involved. You can contact me. I can try and help you later, but it's not within the scope of this particular webinar to give you a recipe for organic feed. Corn gluten meal is a nice source of protein. Unfortunately, it's very expensive, so it's not typically used, but if you have a reasonably priced source of it, it can be used in poultry diets. Come on. Okay, it said animal products. Meat and bone meal is the most common of the animal byproducts. Typically, it's not cows, it's pigs because of the mad cow disease. It's rendered, so it kills off any bacteria or whatever. Feather meal is another byproduct. It doesn't look like feathers. It takes the proteins in the feathers and breaks it down by rendering. Feather meal is not as popular as the meat and bone meal or just meat meal. Both products, if they're not used in rendering to produce a food product, are put into landfill. So it is important for recycling of materials to do that. Okay, fish meal is a common protein source added to poultry diets. You again have to be very careful on how much you do, 2-3%, because of the omega-3s and the smell of fish. You don't want your products that you're producing, eggs or meat, to smell of fish. DDGS, dried distillers grains with solubles, can be from corn or rye or barley or whatever. Make sure that you find out the nutrient content of it, but they can be used as a protein source for both broilers and layers. They can, okay. I have bone meal and feather meal as 2 amendments on my farm. Is it the same product you're talking about? Probably. I've not studied it as the amendment, but if it's bone meal, that's different from meat and bone meal, but feather meal is probably the same thing. I'll get into bone meal shortly. Alfalfa meal is another protein source that you can use. It's basically dehydrated alfalfa. It's high in fiber, so you can't use more than 2 or 3%, but it does get some protein in it. It is a good source of methionine. And it does give you the brighter colored yolks that some people like to see, especially if you're trying to free range in the winter when there isn't a lot of pasture to eat. You can feed the alfalfa, dehydrated alfalfa, to get that colorful yolk. Okay, dietary minerals. There's the macro minerals. There's the calcium and phosphorus. Calcium is involved in bone formation, egg quality. It's also important in blood clotting, muscle contraction, and a lot of other metabolic activities. Phosphorus is important in bone development. It's part of cell membranes and is required for many metabolic functions. Chlorine is important in the formation of hydrochloric acid in the stomach and thus plays a role in digestion. Sodium and potassium are electrolytes that are important for metabolic, muscle, and nerve functions. And magnesium assists with metabolic and muscle functions. They're usually provided as a macro mineral, so that they'll be provided as an ingredient in itself. So limestone, for example, is a great source of calcium. Bone meal, which you were referring to as your amendment, is a calcium source for poultry, especially the layers. Dicalcium phosphate has calcium as well as phosphate. You can get trace mineralized salt, so you're getting the trace minerals as well as the salt. And when we look at the micro minerals, I mean, we're talking copper, iodine, iron, magnesium, selenium, zinc. They're all required in very small amounts. That's why they call them micro or trace minerals. And these are typically given in a trace mineral premix. They are trying to find other sources of it to be more organic, but basically you have to use the salts of the particular minerals in order for it to work. The vitamins, as I said, you need the fat soluble as well as the water soluble. The A, D, E, and K are the fat solubles. You get all your B vitamins, and vitamin C are your water solubles. And you got to make sure you get the right proportions to the level of feed that they are eating. Okay, so once you take all those different ingredients together, you got to look at how they manufacture the feed, or if you're mixing yourself, but most of this relates to commercial manufacturing. Some add the addition of fats to the diets, not only for the energy content, but it slows down the rate of passage and increases digestion. Some places will use steam pelleting and conditioning, which improves the utilization of certain nutrients. They can use dietary enzymes, especially for the alternative types of feed products. Helps to break down any of the poorly digested dietary components. They use a synthetic amino acids, specifically methionine for poultry, sometimes lysine. Lysine's more of a pig thing, but methionine is the main one for poultry, and it allows them to have the balance of all the amino acids at a lower total protein content. So protein's expensive, so you can reduce the level of total protein in the diet by using some synthetic methionine. That